Welcome back to the Rock Show on GTFM 107.9. For the next 20 minutes or so, it's all about Led Zeppelin. And a very good reason why we're playing that particular track is because there's a great new book out from a gentleman called Dave Lewis. It's called Led Zeppelin, Feather in the Wind Over Europe 1980. Dave is the leading chronicler, if that's the right word, of the band and members. He founded Tight But Loose, the Led Zeppelin magazine, in 1978, the official Led Zeppelin magazine. It's out 3 times per year. And he also wrote a book called Then As It Was, Led Zeppelin at Nebworth 1979. And this is kind of the follow-up. Would that be right, Dave?
Yeah, it is, very much so. Yeah, obviously the Nebworth gigs, had gone incredibly well for Led Zeppelin. 200,000 people came. And I think the thing with them at the time was what to do next. So to go to Europe and play a very low-key tour, the first tour they'd done for 3 years, was a very brave move. And it was a very different Led Zeppelin, that was on stage at that point. So to do this book, it's really good to take that story into the final days of Led Zeppelin. And, I was lucky enough to be there. So it's great to relay it all.
Let's go back a few steps before we focus on the book and tell us a bit about yourself, because you've not been on my show before. You became a big fan at 13, was it? 13 years old?
Yeah, I first heard Led Zeppelin on Pig of the Pops, the Alan Freeman show on a Sunday, where he used to do the chart rundown, and being Fluff, he began to put album tracks in, and one day he played something called Whole Lot of Love by someone called Led Zeppelin, but it wasn't someone, it was a band.
Yeah.
And once I heard that, I needed to know more.
Not off.
So I immediately got Led Zepp 2, backtracked to Zepp 1, and the rest is history. It's been a lasting effect. I obviously wanted to see them live, and I was lucky enough to go in 1971, Empire Hall, Wembley. Then the next year, Alexandra Palace. And then it was a case of, if they were going to play, I was going to try and get there. So when they did the Earls Court shows, I did all of those. And that's when the point came about wanting to write about Led Zeppelin and, trying to chronicle them, because, Led Zeppelin didn't have fan clubs. That was for the Osmonds. So there wasn't any sort of communication, or a vast amount of communication between their fans, and themselves. And obviously they weren't very good bedfellows with the press, that they really sort of suffered in their relationship, particularly in America. So, they were reticent, I think, to give sort of information out. So as a fan, I thought, I need to see if I can do something about this. So I came up with the idea of this fanzine, which was called Tight But Loose, after an expression that Jimmy and Robert had both used to sort of summarise their music, which I thought, had a real good ring about it. So it sort of went on from there. I was lucky enough, one of the reasons I sort of did it was at the time punk rock was in, and there was a lot of South sort of styled fanzines. The Sex Pistols had one, and it was a sort of do-it-yourself thing where you could just write it, sort of handwrite it, which is what I did with the first one. But it grew from there, and very luckily their record company Swan Song and their management were very keen for it. They were quite happy for it to happen. It was quite a low-key thing, and then I began to get some very good access, which ended with me on the side of the stage when they were playing in Europe. So for me, at 23 years old, it was incredibly exciting to be part of their world.
Amazing. I'm actually on the Tight But Loose website quite a considerable amount. It really is one of the best resources of all things Zeppelin.
Thank you.
So good on you for that. Yeah. So obviously, although you've written the 2 books now, or you've written more than 2 books actually.
There's a fair few, but they're the last 2 that I self-published.
Yeah. This Led Zeppelin really is a bit of a labour of love for you, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, having been a fan for so long, and I'd still call myself a fan, but it's been great, to chronicle it in the way I have done, because, the level of detail that I know to put in the books, is pretty immense, and, the accuracy that I try and, strive for is also something I'm very keen to. I mean, I think Led Zeppelin over the years have been well misrepresented in, in many ways, and there have been books that haven't told the story as it should be. So I like to think anything I do, with the Tight But Loose name is done with integrity, and that's certainly something that I've always, really strived for. And I think, if you look at the Europe book, I've certainly succeeded in that. I think people who read it's all a question of trying to bring people closer to the music, because this music, will never die. Led Zeppelin, as long as people listen to music, there'll be Led Zeppelin, and it's incredible to think all these years later, 31 years ago, nobody realised that this, legacy was going to grow as it has done, and they were going to be so influential. I always knew Led Zeppelin was good, but I don't think, anybody knew that it was going to be like it is now. And it lives and breathes every day. Even for a band that haven't, appeared or as a working band for 31 years, it really touches people. And so it's great to be able to touch, old fans and new fans, in what I do. So, I feel, quite a privilege, really.
They do really have a bit of a mythical status. I mean, I know they were kind of around for a few years, but it was quite a short-lived career, really, sadly, which we'll come on to in a bit. But, you're right. I mean, there's not many people keeping the legacy going, apart from the members themselves. And, of course, you waving the flag.
Yeah, I think the thing with Zeppelin, it was all encompassed, in 11 years. And what you've got to think about is that during that time, for the whole of that lane virtually, they were at the top. There was never a time where Led Zeppelin had a number 2 album. They were always at the top. After the first album got accepted and they went to the States and had such a major impact. And the way they moulded their career, they never stopped. They always moved on. Sort of ever onward, was a catchphrase, certainly that they used. And I think that's the incredible thing. The quality of their work was so immense. And I think also it's really lasted the test of time. It sounds so fresh. Any of those albums, you feel it could have been recorded last week. I think that catalogue is such an esteemed catalogue, and I think that's the thing about Zeppelin. The quality control in everything they did was A1, and that's one of the reasons it's lasted, is because the care that went into making the albums, the sheer musicianship that went into making the band what it was as a live act, has really, hit home and still resonates with people whenever they play those tracks. I mean, just listening to In the Evening, I've heard that, a million times. But, there was still a shiver up my spine when that intro came in. And, I'm not the only one by any means. So It's a fantastic thing that it's gone on like it has.
Now, Feather in the Wind over Europe 1980, the book itself, let's talk about the book now.
Sure.
What strikes me, it was obviously very poignant that nobody knew that it was going to be their last tour ever.
No, I mean, what was great about it as well was it was a very low-key tour. I mean, in the scheme of things, it was completely different to one of the American tours, or the last American tour they'd done in 1977. And, compared to the scale of Nebworth, it was completely different because the light show was scaled down, the look of the stage was done so. There was no Days to Confuse, there was no Moby Dick, there was no lasers, or it was just them playing their music again, which is how they started, and I think they felt a sense of rejuvenation in trying to do that, and definitely what they were trying to do was mould themselves into a band again, to go back to America and to come back to England again, and take their, rightful place. I think there'd been a lot of bands that had come through, and they had a lot of inactivity for various reasons. We know, quite a lot of that was sort of tragic. But I think they really felt they wanted to reclaim their crown, and to do that, they needed to go and play to audiences again. And so to do 14 dates in 2 weeks, two and a half weeks, was something they hadn't done for a long time. So that, and being very low key, I think they could feel the audience again. And I think certainly when we were at those shows, that came through. There was a definite feeling, we can do this again, and we can do it in a way we did it in 1968 and 69. And that, there's no doubt about it. Led Zeppelin had new places to go. It's such a shame and such a tragedy that what happened in, the September 31 years ago ground it to a halt. And that, so again, being on that tour, and we didn't know it was going to be the last one. I was definitely going to go to America. I think they were going to go over there and really blast it.
How many dates did you go to in the Europe?
I did 5. Okay. Cologne, Frankfurt, Mannheim, 2 shows, and then Munich.
Because what is particularly amazing about the book, I mean, for anybody, obviously I've got the benefit of seeing it, But I mean, the detail is amazing. You've got every gig. You've got an analysis and the track listing. You've got the full amount of people who've done bootlegs and mostly the covers of them in their memorabilia, and a fairly statistical appendix section. I mean, even one thing that just amazed me, you even got all the people who were in the crew, even the truck drivers. You listed their names. And I mean, okay, if you want to know what guitar Jimmy Page was playing on a certain song, it's in there. But to find out the names of truck drivers and stuff like that, and the pictures, mate, are absolutely amazing.
Yeah, again, I mean, with the level of detail, as I said earlier, when I tend to do these things, I do go into the finer detail as much as I can. It's something I've always done. The pictures are especially pleasing because it's quite a paradox that on that tour, it's the least professionally photographed tour they ever did. There was very few actual proper photographers covering the tour. A few dates in Germany, but apart from that, there wasn't a lot. But what there was very luckily, my colleague that I went with, Tom, we had our cameras and we took a lot of shots from the side of the stage. Very different looking shots from what you'd normally see.
So a lot of these shots are yours, are they?
Yeah,
okay.
They're mine and Tom's, and,
right.
and then lots of them also from other fans that went to other gigs. So what you've got, they're not slick. They're not, I would say, that's not the point. But what they've got is incredible atmosphere.
Yeah.
What you're looking at is literally the last days of Led Zeppelin as it was happening, as seen from the audience, which I think, is incredibly poignant and also incredibly exciting to look at because it really does tell the story.
Yeah. Amazing.
So yeah, there were some amazing days, and it's fantastic that I think there's a chronicle there that says this is the last days of Led Zeppelin. And if you wanted to know what happened and when on that tour, it's all in there.
Yeah, and you didn't get any grief from Peter Grant or any of the members about the pictures and stuff?
No, I think the thing about the Europe tour, as I said earlier, it was such a low-key tour that they were quite happy for us to be there. They were quite happy for me to stand on the side of the stage. That probably wouldn't have happened in Madison Square Garden, but Peter Grant saw us go through. I always had a good relationship with Peter. I did a massive interview with him in one of the last interviews he ever did in 1993. So, I think they saw what I did was pretty genuine. And when you read about all the, the Hammer the God stuff, the sex and drugs and rock and roll, I think they'd done it all. There was nothing. All that was left was to play the music, and I think that's what they did on that tour, and that's what they wanted to do as they're moving ahead. And, so I think the fact that we had such close proximity said a lot about the state of Led Zeppelin, that, they wanted to go back to the people, and that's something they really did on that tour.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, you hint on here, and I don't know if this is true, but I'm sort of trying to read between the lines if I'm allowed, that the Berlin show was Led Zeppelin's last show, July 7th, 1980.
Yeah, indeed.
They were scheduling US dates in October.
Yeah, they were all set to go. There was, an amount of dates that they were going to play. Chicago was named,
now,
a few others.
Would it be fair, you were on the inside, a straight question here, would it be fair to say that John Bonham was concerned about doing them?
Well, I think he was concerned about being away from home, because he was getting increasingly, sort of homesick to go back. When we on that tour, we saw them several times, in the hotels, and I chatted to John quite a lot, and he was enjoying playing as much as ever. And again, if you hear him playing all through the the latter era of Zeppelin, he was right on the game. If you look at Into the Outdoor, things like Fall in the Rain, and he really drove the band still. But I think what was happening, it was a change in time. They'd been doing it a long time, and they'd had tragedy in their lives, and with Robert, with his child dying and such like. And I think John wanted to do the tours without a doubt. But what they were trying to do when they went to America, this is quite an interesting point, is that the schedule was only going to be for a month. So they were only going to go out there and do an amount of dates, and then they were going to come back, and then there'd be a second leg. So these 70-day tours or whatever, were not going to happen anymore for them. It was too much. So
right.
I think they had to find a new way of approaching the touring. It was a changing climate. There was lots of things that were different, about, the whole musical landscape as well. I mean, obviously, with punk rock and new wave coming in and new wave of heavy metal, there was, it was changing times. They needed to find a way of working that would work for them because, they'd been doing it a long time now, and it had got a bit of a slog, I think, with some of the things that had happened, and I think they were determined to try and wipe all that away. And I say it was really about the music. I was incredibly lucky that a week before John Bonham died, I was actually in the Swansong office when Jimmy Page was in there, and I had a one-on-one with him for about 30 minutes, and he was showing me a model of the stage that they'd set up to for the tour, for the American tour, and he was showing me how it was going to work, and his enthusiasm, and real passion for what he was doing was all still there, and it's incredibly poignant to think a week later the rug was pulled, and the rest is history. It was an incredible. Untimely event, because they really were on the crest of, I think, a new era, and they would have gone into the new decade very fresh. I think there might have been solo albums. I think they may have done things like that and then come back together. But the one thing I would say about the final days of Led Zeppelin, this wasn't a washed-up band. This wasn't a band that had passed its peak.
No,
there were new peaks to find, and I think they were trying to find them against a lot of misfortune that had happened in the previous 4 or 5 years. So
yeah, I mean, sadly, I think In Through the Outdoor was much maligned at the time, wasn't it? But I think it stood the test of time as a great album.
They went into Polar Studios, and they had an amount of good material. They even left some of the best tracks off. Ozone Baby, Wearing and Tearing. They kept those off the next time round. So there was no lack of quality control. There was lots going on. It did very well. It saved the American music business when it came out, because it was completely in the doldrums. That album was #1 in the States for, I think, 6 to 8 weeks, and it did well here. The reviews were mixed, but by then I think they'd given up on the press anyway, and it wasn't about the press. At the end of the day, it was about the people that came to see them, the people that bought the records. And when you look at their last gigs in the UK, 200,000 people came. They still had an audience. But what they needed to do was find a way of finding that audience. And as I say in the book, one of the things they should have done was to gone back and done 5 nights at Newcastle City Hall, to done 5 nights at the London Labour or something. And I think that would have happened. That would have brought them really back into focus, because it had got so big. Once you've done Nebworth, there's nowhere else to go, is there?
No.
You've got to go back. And I think that would have been a really exciting period. Was there
any talk about UK dates?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the plan was to come back in the spring of '81, and there was talk of going back to Japan and Australia. Right. There were territories that they hadn't been to for some years, and there was definitely. I know Peter Grant had a big plan that there would be a world tour in '81, and but it would have been done on their terms, and that they didn't need to be away for weeks on end, because, as I said, this situation, certainly with John Bonham, and to a point Robert Plant, who didn't want to spend lots of time, on the road away from families, they were getting older as well. They'd seen it all. I can't remember when they first joined the band. They were like 19 and 20. Those guys, and they'd grown up with it. And I think it was Led Zeppelin finding a way forward as a mature band, and there weren't many bands of their scale that had been around that long, really. So, again, it was just something of a new era, and I think the book certainly represents that, and certainly, again, one of the things that you talk about is what could have happened, and it would have been really interesting. I think they would have struggled a little bit, possibly here, because bands like Iron Maiden, Def Leppard were taking a lot of their audience, because some fans were fed up with waiting. But I think had they gone back to the people, done those, done a proper tour, they'd have been back at #1. They just would have been.
Yeah. On September 25th, 1980, we lost John Henry Bonham. The announcement that Led Zeppelin wouldn't carry on without him came a little bit later.
Indeed. Yeah.
You've chronicled that in the book very well.
Yeah.
Do you think it was the right decision?
Yeah, it was. At the time, it was the only one. I think, on reflection, they'd been together so long as a unit of 4 people, and that to make Led Zeppelin's music, it needed that chemistry of 4 people. Now, I know The Who carried on after Keith Moon, and various bands have since. I think in this era, there'd have been a lot more pressure for them to continue, because it was a big money-making machine. But in those days,
there still is, isn't there? To be fair, Dave.
Yeah, well, of course it is, but even more now. But then, I think the ethics that they gave to Atlantic Records, it didn't come into, well, we've got to get someone else. You're our biggest selling act. it was what's right for the band. It was right because, that, as I said, it's about those four people. Now, you know, when they played the O2, you know, and obviously, you know, they had Jason, who was fantastic, you know, and it was certainly the spirit of Led Zeppelin, and it was a fantastic night, and we all walked away, you know, with a really, really happy ending. But, you know, at that time, it had to be the end, really, and they had to move on. Maybe they could have come back together in some way. I mean, they did those things like, you know, the Live Aid shows and that, but they all needed space to think about what was going to happen and, you know, the impact that it had all had. It's quite funny, actually, at the time, and quite strange that when they did make that, you know, big announcement, December the 4th, 4 days later, John Lennon got shot, and all, you know, that it sort of buried the Led Zeppelin news. You know, it was not, because the Lennon thing was such a catastrophic event, it almost got lost that Led Zeppelin had, you know, sort of retired, as it were. So for a couple of years, you know, they were pretty unfashionable. It's a bizarre thing to think, but once we got into the 80s and bands, you know, like, you know, Cole, Mission, etc., were beginning to name check them, and then Live Aid happened, and it all clicked in, and people realised that these musicians were going to be, you know, if you wanted to play guitar, you want to play guitar like Jimmy Page. If you want to sing, you want to sing like Robert Plant, etc. So, in the end, it came full circle, and certainly, you know, for the last 25 years, you know, they've been in the public eye and will remain so. And it's, you know, as I always say, Led Zeppelin is never spoken in, you know, the past tense. It's always present. It's always, you know, it's on the road with tribute bands all over the world. It's, you know, it's on Match of the Day. I played, I think it was Levy Breaks the other day as a backdrop to something. You know, Led Zeppelin lives and breathes, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
And again, you know, through the books and what I do with my magazine, you know, the aim is to take people back to the music, you know, with a fresh sort of view, and you know, and that's certainly something that I've tried to do with the book. Let's mention the O2 gig. You were there. You were present. Indeed, I was.
And it was a wonderful night, I believe.
It was a wonderful night. They had a lot to lose that night. You know, they had put their neck on the line. You know, they had to come back with something special because Led Zeppelin was about that. Led Zeppelin was, you know, very, very special. So to reproduce it was always going to be a pressure, and obviously bringing in Jason was the right move. But they rehearsed very hard. You know, the set was very balanced, and it never looked at any point like these guys were trying to reclaim former glories. It wasn't only good, it exceeded expectations. Now, I expected it to be pretty good because, you know, as I said, they had a lot to lose. But it went into the stratosphere. I mean, when they did Kashmir, you know, as the closing finale of the main set, that was as good as Kashmir as I've ever heard. And I heard it in Earls Court, in Mannheim, in Nebworth. But when I heard it in the O2, it was as good as I've heard it. And that, you know, and the thing is, you know, obviously there was big pressure for them to carry on, and I know, you know, Jimmy and Jonesy, you know, got together with Jason. There was talk of other vocalists, and Robert didn't want to do it. But in the end, you've got to walk away, you know, with the fact that everyone said goodbye in the right way to Led Zeppelin. Everyone now knows why it was important, and, you know, all the fuss that, you know, was, you know, sort of created around the gig made it really, I think, worthwhile of them doing it. And I think there was a great, you know, comment from Plant before the gig. He said, we need to do one more great gig. And they did. They needed to sign off. And, you know, that was a fantastic thing to do. So
you don't think Plant's, you know, because he's the stubborn one, isn't he?
Yes,
really?
he is.
You don't think he's done the wrong thing by saying, no, I don't want to do it anymore?
Well, you know, it's very easy.
Because I've got to tell you, Dave, when I spoke to him, I interviewed him, you know, when he did his first couple of solo albums, and he said, I want to wrap Led Zeppelin in cotton wool and get it out from time to time and stroke it and look at it, but that's it.
Yeah, well,
and I think that was a reasonable statement,
that's
and he's
typically Robert. And
he's stuck by that, really,
he
isn't
has.
he?
That's typically Robert. You have to remember that, ironically, at the time of the O2, he was having big success with Alison Krauss, and then that went on to be a Grammy-winning album. So the timing wasn't great, I guess. You know, maybe if he'd have been at a looser end, maybe there would have been some more dates. I mean, it's easy for me to sit here and say, oh, you know, there was no more dates, so what? I was lucky enough to be there, but a lot of people weren't.
Yeah,
they could have done, I don't know, 3 in New York, 3 in LA, 3 back here, you know, 3 in Japan maybe. But then you get to the point where if it's the 30th reunion gig, it's not quite got, you know, the same sort of stigma, you know, as the first. And then you're going to get into a world tour thing where, you know, like a lot of bands have reformed and done world tours. Zeppelin was never going to do that. I think, in a way, by not doing it, the legacy is intact, because again, that O2, when that comes out eventually, and they will put it out one day on, Blu-ray and DVD, I'm sure it will come. And when it does, people will see, and it doesn't matter when they do it, next week, next year, whenever, people will want it, because it is a remnant of an amazing night and an amazing finale to this incredible story. But who knows, maybe there'll be something else that, will make them want to do another one-off. I wouldn't rule that out, but, you're not going to get, a Led Zeppelin tour. It's never going to happen.
No.
But what is good, and, the way I'd summarise the O2 is, it was a great goodbye.
Yeah.
And everyone could say and walk away with their heads held high, and that's a fantastic thing. And I think that on the night was such a warm glow that, has carried on since. So, and it left it untarnished. And they proved on one night, for one night only, they proved that Led Zeppelin was the best.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
As the archivist and chronicler of the band, and I assume their members, are you currently in touch with the guys at all?
Very much. I very much track their careers, and I'm in touch with management and stuff. And when Robert did his tour last year with the Band of Joy, I went to several of those shows. Did an interview with his manager, Bill Kerbersley. John Paul Jones, I've done various interviews with, and obviously with them, Cookie Vultures was a great buzz, and he's just done C6 Steve, and obviously Jimmy, with his book, which he had out last year. I went to the launch of that, and so I'm always in there, and I'm always very interested to see what happens next, because as much as I said we talk about Led Zeppelin, as a band, I think as solo members and solo careers, they again have put so much in. Robert has done some fantastic stuff, and it's amazing how he's come through in recent years.
Oh,
with
absolutely,
them Cookie Vultures.
Yeah.
And I know when we went to see them Cookie Vultures, and they named the band members like they do. Well, he got the biggest cheer. No doubt about it. No disrespect to Dave Grohl and Josh Homme, and and it's the same with Jimmy. Whatever he does, there's a stigma, with him. And I think whatever happens with Jimmy, let's hope there's some new music ahead, and I've got no reason to believe there won't be. People will still want to see Jimmy Page because he carries the Led Zeppelin legacy, and at the end of the day, Led Zeppelin was his band, and I think he's a big keeper of the flame. He's got his website, which has a daily sort of diary, which is really fascinating to read. It goes up for one day, and he'll say what he was doing on this day in any part of his lasting career. Which again, Jimmy Page has been he's had a 50-year career, which is people forget that.
Yeah.
And he is the keeper of the flame, and the whole thing with Zeppelin and their members, obviously Jason as well with Black Country Communion. As I say, they're able to do so much still without having to do the Zeppelin thing, because in Band of Joy shows, Plant does Zeppelin numbers, and Jonesy's done bits and pieces. So I think it will always carry on, and they will, hearing those songs live by the people that recorded them is always going to be a big attraction.
Brilliant.
So it's good.
Okay, Dave. Well, thanks for joining us. Tell people how we can get hold of your book.
It's from
published
the website.
From Tight But Loose, isn't it? Which is your company, so to speak.
It's from our website. It's not actually the official magazine, as you said.
Isn't it? Okay.
No, it's not the official, but it certainly is respected, I'd like to think, with a lot of integrity.
Right.
It's available from the website Tight But Loose, and www.tblweb.com will take you straight to it. You can get the books there. You can get my Tight But Loose magazine. New issue is just out. Lovely shot of Jimmy on the cover, as you'll see. So all my products you can get from the website. And as I say, with the book, if you want to know about the last days of Led Zeppelin, Feather in the Wind, Led Zeppelin Over Europe, 1980 is the book to get.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us. Do you have any other books in the pipeline?
Oh, yes. There's always something ahead. The next one, we're going to revamp the Nebworth book that I did 2 years ago. There's a lot more information come through, and we're going to revamp that into a second edition.
Blimey.
That's coming out early next year. And there's various other plans. There's certainly things that I will do, and I will take another snapshot in time of a Led Zeppelin period and do it, the same justice with the same sort of detail, because I think fans really love this sort of stuff, and it's certainly something that I want to continue to do. And as I say, I feel a privilege to do it, because this band affect people's lives, and it will continue to do that. as long as people play music, Led Zeppelin will be in there.
Well, I hope that you'll be able to join us again then.
I'm sure I will, Andy. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay, good to speak to you, Dave. Thank you very much for your time, and
Alrighty.
thank you from me, as a big Zeppelin fan, for keeping the flame alive.
Thank you, mate. Thank you very much.
All the best to you.
Cheers.
Cheers.